When I was in 7th grade, we had a math teacher named Mr. Kruger, and let me tell you, from the very first day, the entire class unanimously decided he was the worst teacher we had ever seen. Picture this. He walks into the classroom, slow and deliberate, juggling a stack of papers and a coffee cup that looked like it had seen better days, probably reheated about 10 times. He sets everything down on his desk, scans the room with this tired expression, and his first words to us are, "Welcome to mathematics." I already know none of you studied. We hadn't even opened our notebooks yet. That was our first sign that this year was going to be a long, long ride. Mr. Kruger operated on a set of rules that were, to put it mildly, strange. Rule number 1 was absolute silence. No talking, not even a whisper. If he heard the slightest peep, he would dramatically stop whatever he was writing on the board, turn around with a slow, theatrical motion, and ask, "Who was that?" In that instant, every single one of us would become intensely fascinated with the lines in our notebooks, avoiding eye contact at all costs. But his second rule was even worse. No asking questions. Seriously, if you dared to raise your hand, he'd let out this heavy sigh and say, if you listened carefully, you wouldn't need to ask. As you can imagine, this didn't exactly clear up our confusion. It just made everything 10 times more mystifying. We were basically left to figure out complex algebra on our own, in complete silence. Then came the infamous chalk incident, a day none of us will ever forget. Mr. Kruger was at the board, passionately scribbling a long, complicated equation. He was pressing down so hard on the chalk that it suddenly snapped in two. One piece went flying through the air, like a tiny white missile, and hit my classmate Kevin right on the forehead. Thwack! The entire class just froze. Time stood still. Kevin, looking completely bewildered, slowly reached up, picked the piece of chalk off his face, and just stared at it. Mr. Kruger, without missing a beat, looked at him and said, "Good, now you have part of the lesson." Not a single person dared to laugh in that moment. We were all in shock, but the second that bell rang and we were safely out in the hallway, the entire class just erupted. We were laughing so hard, holding on to each other for support. It was one of those absurd moments that you just can't make up. If there was one thing Mr. Kruger loved more than silence and not answering questions, it was assigning an impossible amount of homework. One Friday, he decided to give us a little weekend project. 20 pages of math problems, 20 pages. The looks on our faces were a mixture of horror and disbelief. Even the Strata students, the ones who usually breezed through everything, looked pale. That entire weekend was a blur of numbers and equations. By Monday morning, when he asked who had finished, only 2 brave souls raised their hands. Mr. Kruger just shook his head, looking genuinely disappointed. Clearly this class lacks dedication, he announced to the room. Meanwhile, the rest of us looked like zombies. We had sacrificed our entire weekend to the god of mathematics, and it still wasn't enough. Just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, he introduced his favorite weapon, the surprise test. You'd walk into class, ready for a normal lesson, maybe even feeling a little relaxed. Then, out of nowhere, he'd say those dreaded words. Take out a piece of paper. A collective groan would ripple through the room. Pop quiz, he'd declare, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk on his face. One time, a student actually gathered the courage to protest, but we didn't study this yet. Mr. Kruger's response was calm, philosophical, and utterly unhelpful. He just said, "Life is full of surprises." It was his answer for everything. We learned quickly that in Mr. Kruger's class, you had to be prepared for anything, at any time. But then, one day, something shifted. Something completely unexpected happened. Mr. Kruger was late for class, which was unusual for him. When he finally walked in, he seemed different, quieter. He put his coffee cup on the desk, just like always, but then he just stood there, looking at all of us. The room was silent, but this time it wasn't a silence born out of fear. It was curiosity. Then he spoke. "I know you all think I'm the worst teacher," he said, his voice softer than we'd ever heard it. The silence in the room became absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because, well, he wasn't wrong. He paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air, and then he continued. "When I was your age," he said, "I had a teacher just like me. strict and difficult. We all leaned in a little. This was a side of Mr. Kruger we had never seen. At the time, I hated him. I thought he was unfair and made my life miserable. But he pushed me harder than anyone else ever had. He looked around the room, making eye contact with a few of us. And because of that teacher, he said, a strange light in his eyes, I became an engineer. And then, for the first time all year, he smiled. A real, genuine smile. Sometimes, he finished. The teachers you dislike the most are the ones trying the hardest to prepare you for what's ahead. Day. After that day, Mr. Kruger didn't magically transform into a fun, easygoing teacher. The surprise tests kept coming. The homework was still a mountain to climb. But something in the classroom had changed. We had changed. We started to see his tough methods not just as a burden, but as a challenge. We started competing with each other to solve the hardest problems, to ace his pop quizzes. And a funny thing happened. By the end of the year, almost every single one of us had become surprisingly good at math. We understood it in a way we never had before. Years have passed since I sat in that 7th grade classroom. And when I look back on all my school memories, it's funny. Mr. Kruger might have felt like the worst teacher ever at the time. He was demanding, unrelenting, and frankly, a little terrifying. But he's also one of the teachers I remember the most vividly. He taught us more than just math. He taught us resilience, discipline, and the quiet satisfaction of overcoming something you thought was impossible. He prepared us for life's surprise tests. And for that, strangely enough, I'm grateful. Thanks for watching, and if you have a story about a teacher who changed your life, I'd love to read it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. See you next time.